In the process of doing this kind of description, anatomists noticed that very different looking animals obviously shared some of the same basic parts. For example, if you look at the forelimbs of different kinds of mammals, by forelimb I mean the limb that would be the same as our arms, it's easy to see that each animal has a forelimb with a quite different shape, reflecting the fact that the forelimb has a different function, but that they nonetheless share components. So, for example, the human forelimb is suited for reaching and grasping. The cat forelimb is suited for walking. A whale's forelimb is suited for swimming. And a bat's forelimb for flying. But in spite of these differences in shape and function, if you dissect these forelimbs, you can see that they include similar arrangements of bones, tendons, muscles, and so forth. These structures are modified in each species, but they share sufficient similarities to appear as though they had been modified from some original common form. We refer to anatomical features having these kinds of similarities as homologous structures. Now, these kinds of homologous structures could be best explained, it was argued, if living forms were not static, but instead had been transformed from some common form that was shared as an earlier ancestor. An even more problematic case was the appearance of structures that had no apparent function at all, so-called vestigial organs or vestigial structures. An example of this might be the tiny hind limb and pelvic bones that are still found in whales, even though those animals have no hind limbs at all. If species were the result of a single perfect creation event, then why should such structures exist at all? A simpler explanation would be that species had changed over time in such a way that previously useful structures had lost their usefulness. Now, the third sort of evidence that species were not immutable came from the branch of science we call paleontology today. Paleontologists are people who study fossils, which of course are the remains of dead organisms from the past, usually preserved in sedimentary rocks. In the early 1800s, paleontologists began to describe fossils of species that were no longer living on the present-day Earth. Now, the existence of these fossils made it obvious that species weren't constant. At least it demonstrated that some species had existed in an earlier time that no longer existed today. Actually, the science who really is credited with founding the field of paleontology, the French anatomist Georges Cuvier, himself was a staunch opponent of the idea that evolution occurred. Cuvier acknowledged that you could find fossils in the fossil record of species that no longer existed, and furthermore that fossils of species that hadn't existed earlier would appear at a later time in the fossil record. But he explained this by suggesting that there must be periodic catastrophes that would wipe out species in an area, and then sometimes new species would move in from other areas, making it seem like new species were being created or that species were being lost, but in fact arguing that over the globe as a whole, species were constant. But there was another observation from the field of paleontology that was harder to explain away. It was obvious that some fossil species were similar enough in their anatomy to be related to living species, while at the same time different enough to clearly have to be classified as a different species. In fact, it was possible to find series of fossil species occurring at different times in the fossil record, which seemed to be connected from one ancient form that looked one way to a modern form that existed today with a number of intermediates in between. This was so common that it was given a name. It was called the law of succession. And it was consistent with the idea that species had transformed from one form earlier to a more recent form through evolution. Okay, these kinds of observations coming from geology, comparative anatomy, and paleontology were much discussed in the early part of the 19th century. And some scientists were beginning to suspect, and in fact even suggest in writing, that species were not immutable. That is, the idea that evolution might occur was beginning to be accepted. But what was not at all clear was how evolution could occur. In other words, what would be a mechanism that could account for an evolutionary transformation of species. Darwin's main contribution, as it turns out, was not to actually suggest that evolution occurs. This was already something out there, although Darwin did amass an impressive collection of evidence to show that evolution occurred in his writing. Instead, Darwin's real contribution was to understand the mechanism by which evolution could occur, which was embodied in his theory of natural selection. Now, several explicit theories for how evolution could occur were suggested before Darwin's time. The most notable of these was a theory proposed by a French biologist named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who published this idea fairly early in 1809. Lamarck argued that the lasting changes that occurred to parts of an individual's body that were brought on by excessive use of those parts, or specially intensive use of those parts, could actually be made permanent and transferred to that individual's offspring. Lamarck referred to this theory as the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. The idea was that an adult would acquire a characteristic and then the offspring would inherit that acquired characteristic from its parent. Now, the fact that use and disuse of an organ or a structure can have a long-lasting effect on shape and size is obviously true. Lamarck, for example, would compare the forearms of a blacksmith to those of ordinary people to make this point. The biceps of the blacksmith became huge over its lifetime because he was pounding metal all the time. In nature, Lamarck suggested that the extensive use of some body part or organ could similarly cause that body part to become modified to better suit its function. Over evolutionary time, Lamarck argued, such changes would accumulate, causing a species to evolve to better fit its environment. Lamarck's best-known example concerned the neck of the giraffe. Giraffes tend to browse on leaves that are high up in trees, and Lamarck argued that giraffes would continually be stretching their necks up, trying to reach even higher leaves. And as they stretched up, they would gradually, subtly, but gradually lengthen their neck. Now, over time, as each individual's neck was lengthened just slightly, they would transmit that slightly increased length to their offspring, and you would gradually get a longer and longer neck over a long period of time. Now, our modern understanding of genetics, and specifically our understanding of the molecular mechanisms of DNA transcription and translation, which we discussed earlier in the course, makes it clear that Lamarck's theory can't work. Because we know that on a molecular level, information can't go from proteins back to DNA. Now, at Lamarck's time, nobody knew anything about these sorts of specifics, and so his theory seemed as plausible as any. Although, in fact, if you look at this closely, you can obviously tell that there's a problem here because the children of blacksmith don't necessarily have big arms. So Lamarck's theory was not widely accepted. Lamarck did get two ideas that are very important correct. First, of course, he was correct to argue that evolution occurs, and he was one of the first scientists to make that argument strongly. Second, and more importantly, he was correct to point out that the environment plays an important role in evolution. Remember, by Lamarck's view, it was the environment that was driving organisms to change. The giraffe was stretching its neck in response to the environment in the sense that it wanted to get leaves higher up in the tree. And as we'll see, the environment is an important part of how evolution works. Now, it was Darwin's opportunity to serve as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle in its voyage around the world that provided him with his first insights into how evolution might work. In fact, it was this voyage that changed his worldview and convinced him that evolution even occurred in the first place. On this voyage, Darwin began to observe for himself and to document the kinds of evidence for evolutionary change that we discussed earlier, concerning geological change, homologies among species, relationships between fossil forms and living forms, and so on. Particularly illuminating to Darwin were groups of animals